Here is a fact that should make you stop and think. Solar energy is now the cheapest electricity ever produced in human history. The cost of a solar panel has fallen by over 90% in the last 10 years. Wind energy is cheaper than gas, cheaper than coal. In many parts of the world, building a new wind farm is now the cheapest way to generate electricity that has ever existed. And yet in 2025, the most recent full year of data, fossil fuels still generated around 57% of the world's electricity. Renewables overtook coal for the first time ever in 2025, a genuine milestone. And yet coal alone still generated more electricity than solar, wind and nuclear combined. The transition is real. The scale of what remains is also real. So why? If renewable energy is cheap, clean and abundant, why aren't we just switching everything to solar and wind and getting on with it? The honest answer involves three interconnected problems, and understanding all three is essential to understanding why the energy transition is taking so long and what it will actually take to succeed. The first problem is intermittency. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. This sounds obvious, but the implications for the electricity grid are more profound than most people realize. Your electricity grid has to balance supply and demand at every single moment, not approximately, not within a reasonable margin. Exactly. The amount of electricity being generated has to match the amount being consumed in real time continuously, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Traditional power stations, gas, coal, nuclear, are what engineers call dispatchable. You can turn them up when demand rises. You can turn them down when demand falls. You control them. Solar and wind are not dispatchable. You cannot tell the sun to shine harder at 6 p.m. when everyone gets home from work and turns on their oven. You cannot tell the wind to blow harder on a cold, still winter's night when heating demand peaks. This creates what's known as the intermittency problem, and it has two distinct parts. The first part is predictable. Solar generates during daylight hours and nothing at night. Wind generates more in winter than summer in the UK. You can plan around these patterns to some degree. The second part is unpredictable. A cloud passes over a solar farm and output drops by 50% in seconds. Wind speeds fluctuate hour to hour, day to day. A high-pressure system settles over the UK for a week in winter, almost no wind, limited daylight, and your renewable generation collapses precisely when heating demand is highest. The grid has to absorb all of this in real time. With traditional generation that's manageable, you run your gas plant a little harder. With a grid running on 80% or 90% renewables, you need something else entirely. You need storage, and storage is where the real challenge begins. The second problem is storage. Battery technology has improved enormously in the last decade. The cost of lithium-ion batteries has fallen by over 90%, a similar trajectory to solar panels. Grid-scale battery storage is now a real and growing part of energy systems worldwide. But here's the honest engineering assessment. A lithium-ion battery stores energy for hours. A typical grid-scale installation can discharge for 2 to 4 hours before it's empty. That's useful. It smooths out the daily solar curve, stores excess generation from windy afternoons, and releases it in the early evening peak. For short-term balancing, batteries work well. The problem is seasonal storage, that week of cold, still, cloudy weather in January. Britain's electricity demand in winter is roughly double its demand in summer, and a significant portion of that extra winter demand arrives on days when renewable generation is at its lowest. To store enough energy to cover that kind of gap, not hours but days or weeks of storage, you need something much larger than lithium-ion batteries. The leading candidate is hydrogen. Generate electricity from renewables when it's abundant, use it to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, store the hydrogen, burn it to generate electricity when you need it. The problem with hydrogen is efficiency. Every time you convert energy from one form to another, you lose some of it. The round-trip efficiency of the hydrogen process, electricity to hydrogen to electricity, is currently around 30 to 40%. You put in 3 units of energy and get 1 back. That's not a reason to abandon hydrogen. It's a reason to be honest that it's an expensive way to store energy, and that making it work at scale requires enormous investment in infrastructure that doesn't yet exist. Pumped hydro. where you pump water uphill when electricity is cheap and let it flow downhill through turbines when you need power, is the most proven form of large-scale energy storage we have. Britain already has some, but the geography required is specific, and the planning and construction timescales are measured in decades. One genuinely promising development is sodium-ion battery technology. Unlike lithium-ion batteries, where lithium supply is concentrated in a handful of countries creating geographic risk and cost pressure, sodium is one of the most abundant elements on Earth, essentially unlimited supply, dramatically lower cost, better performance in cold temperatures than lithium-ion, longer cycle life over repeated charge and discharge cycles. Sodium-ion batteries are already going into vehicles in China, and grid-scale deployment is expected to accelerate from 2027. If the cost and performance projections hold, sodium-ion could be what makes genuinely affordable large-scale grid storage possible, addressing the key economic barrier that has held back the storage revolution so far. The storage problem is solvable, but it is not solved, and the gap between we have the technology in principle and we have it deployed at the scale required is where most of the real work needs to happen. The third problem is grid stability, and this one is the least understood. In April 2025, Spain experienced one of the largest blackouts in European history. Around 15 gigawatts of electricity generation, roughly 60% of the country's supply, disappeared from the grid in a matter of seconds. The lights went out across most of Spain and parts of Portugal and France. The immediate cause was a voltage anomaly, but the underlying reason was more fundamental. Traditional power stations, coal, gas, nuclear, hydro, use large rotating generators. These generators have physical mass, they spin, and that spinning mass provides something called inertia. When supply and demand on a grid fall out of balance, when a power station suddenly trips offline, or demand spikes unexpectedly, the inertia of those spinning generators acts as a natural buffer. It absorbs the shock. It buys the grid operators time, seconds, sometimes minutes, to respond and restore balance. Solar panels and wind turbines don't have inertia. They generate electricity through electronics rather than rotating mass. When something goes wrong, there's no buffer. The grid can destabilize in fractions of a second. Spain had been closing its conventional power stations as it added more renewables. It had reduced its grid inertia to dangerously low levels. When the voltage anomaly hit, there was nothing to absorb it. This is the grid stability problem. It's solvable. Grid-forming inverters can provide synthetic inertia electronically. Interconnectors to neighbouring grids provide backup, but it requires redesigning grid management systems that have worked on rotating inertia for over a century. It requires significant investment, and it requires the kind of careful systems-level thinking that doesn't always make headlines but determines whether the lights stay on. So, why can't we just switch everything to solar and wind? We can, eventually. With the right investment in storage, grid infrastructure, and management systems, the engineering path exists, but it's not a matter of building enough solar panels and wind turbines. The panels and turbines are the easy part. The hard part is everything that makes them work as a reliable system, the storage that covers the gaps, the grid infrastructure that connects everything, the stability mechanisms that keep the whole thing from collapsing when something goes wrong. And then there are the barriers that aren't engineering problems at all. Planning permission for new wind farms, solar farms, grid upgrades and interconnectors gets delayed or blocked for years. The grid upgrades needed to connect new renewable generation to demand centres require pylons and cables that face fierce local opposition. Short electoral cycles, governments rarely last more than 4 or 5 years, create structural pressure against committing to infrastructure projects that take 20 years to deliver. The incentive structure of democratic politics rewards what can be delivered before the next election, not what needs to be built over the next 2 decades. It is worth pausing on what the alternative looks like in practice, setting aside, for a moment, the very real questions about political freedom and control that come with it. China launched its Air Pollution Prevention and Control Action Plan in 2013, a 20 to 30-year plan with specific targets, specific timescales, and the political continuity to actually deliver on them. The results are documented. Beijing's average PM 2.5 pollution levels fell 67% between 2013 and 2025. Cities that were genuinely dangerous to breathe in a decade ago have been transformed. China now accounts for more than half of all global solar capacity additions, and solar and wind together reach 22% of China's electricity generation in 2025. This is not an endorsement of China's political system. It is an observation about what long-term planning capability, the ability to commit to a 20-year infrastructure program and actually execute it, produces in energy transition terms. The Western democratic challenge is real. How do you build infrastructure that takes 20 years on a 4-year political cycle? There are partial answers: independent infrastructure bodies, cross-party commitments, legally binding targets, but none of them fully solve the problem. And the gap between the planning timescales required and the political cycles available remains one of the most underappreciated barriers to the energy transition. None of these barriers are insurmountable. Countries are navigating them. Progress is real and accelerating, but the honest answer to why we haven't switched everything to solar and wind yet is this: because cheap generation is only one part of a reliable energy system, and building the rest of it is harder, more expensive, and takes longer than the headline cost of a solar panel suggests. That's what this channel is about. The honest engineering assessment of how we actually get there. New video every Thursday. If this made you think, hit like. It helps more people find the channel. Subscribe, and I'll see you next week.